Yes. I'm not going to go into yet another socialist speaker model. I don't know enough about Konstantin Chernenko's speaking style to speak helpfully about that, so I'm just going to go straight into the next session. We are running a little bit behind time, which I take as the mark of a successful event. It can be spun that way. And we'll head right into it for the professionals. And we're welcoming a group of illustrious alumni under this heading, as we did yesterday as well, and I'll be passing the gavel, at least metaphorically, for oversight and timekeeping to our distinguished alumna, Jill Dougherty. Jill graduated from the University of Michigan, which is why she's here, with a BA in Russian language and literature in 1970. Since 1983, she has worked for CNN. Many of you will recognize her, no doubt, from that work, using the Russian skills that she learned here to take the position of CNN Moscow bureau chief. That was a post I believe she took in 1997, is that correct? Where she covered stories including the Chechen conflict, the arrest and trial of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, and the revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine, traveling throughout the geographically expanded domains of our region. Currently, she's the CNN Foreign Affairs correspondent. She's based in Washington, but she's still traveling widely to cover world events. Jill.
Thank you very much. All right. Well, you know, already I feel that we've kind of begun in this last session, and I found it very, very stimulating, and I'm very excited. I think we have a great panel, and diverse panel, I must say. I mean, we have art, we have finance, and we have human rights, all on the same panel. And I think since we have until noon, which is great, they asked me to give just a little opening maybe about the, I would call it serendipitous way that I got to do what I'm doing and where it started. And it's, you know, so we talked about this at lunch, I think, too. You know, the students and journalism students often say, hey, how do you get to be a journalist? How do you get into broadcasting and everything? And I usually say, well, because I happened to get into a Russian course in high school, which is really how it happened. And so there was no planning involved, but I will keep this kind of brief, but I think it is, to me, and I go back to that, is that on? Well, let's see. It is on. Maybe it's just low. Maybe I'll move it closer. Is that better? I'll move it a little closer. So, serendipity and Russian, but I do think it's important because when I think back, and I do think back a lot on my life, and you know how important Russian is to me. In fact, right now, in my spare time, I'm taking a course at Georgetown. I'm working on a master's at Georgetown in international relations, and I'm taking a course in Anna Karenina, which I should say, it's Russian culture, literature, and film, and I just wrote a paper on Anna Karenina, so it's very much on my mind. It never ends. But anyway, you know, I got into Russian in high school because I went to a public high school in Scranton, Pennsylvania, which was very, very good, had a lot of languages, and one of them was Russian. And when I look back in that period, you know, the teacher, was Russian extraction. His family had come out after World War II. And talk about serendipity. My sister and I have a twin sister, studied Russian right from the beginning because we thought it was a challenge. I mean, it just seemed, you know, Spanish would be interesting, French, but why not? You know, so we took Russian and immediately got hooked. And this man, with whom I'm still in contact, gave up his free period when we were in our 4th year, because legally he couldn't give a course for fewer than 6 kids. And Pam and I were the only ones left standing. So he said, okay, if you promise to work hard, then I'll give you my free period. And so we had like a tutor for the last year. And then we went to a women's college in Boston, ran out of Russian classes, essentially. And seriously, we looked around, and then it was natural to come to Michigan, because it was really the place that to me was just you know, one of the excellent centers for studying Russian. And so that's why we came here. And then also that was a period where you had the government funding the study of critical languages, which is another, I will give you an hour lecture on why I think the government ought to be doing this in a serious fashion. I mean, I do think that the government I know we're poverty-stricken, but I do think it is very important to fund critical languages. So my sister and I benefited from NDFL, if people remember those, National Defense Foreign Language Fellowships, and a variety of other things that allowed us to go to St. Petersburg, Leningrad, and study several times. So I have turned up in, Russia like a bad penny over the years for many, many different things. I worked with USIA exhibits back in the 70s, and I guess it was all the 70s. And then when I went with CNN, I kept going back, even though I wasn't permanently there. I was there for a lot of events, and continue to be completely addicted and interested in the field. The other thing that I do feel is, and I'll just make this pitch, and I kind of said it there, I really do think that there are trends in languages, and probably if I were doing it now, and I would love to study Chinese, I really would. And I worked in Hong Kong after Moscow as the managing editor for CNN in Asia, the Asia Pacific area, for 2 years. And I got to know a little bit about Asia, and it is fascinating. But so many things are connected now. And I have friends out in Seattle at the University of Washington who look at Russian studies from an Asian perspective, Asian Pacific. And I've been in the Far East, and they're a different breed from Moscow. I mean, there's some very interesting business people in the Far East who just say, Moscow? Schmoscow, forget it. We're going to do our thing. So I think it's a vibrant field, and I take it as my job to kind of keep the interest in Russia going. At CNN, they call upon me for things that deal with Russia, and I think it's crucially important, a little quiescent, only because the government, I would say, the government, the State Department right now, have their hands filled with the Mideast and North Africa and Afghanistan and Iraq. I understand that, but there's a lot happening in this part of the world. So with that brief introduction, I want to get to our panel because I'm really looking forward to their presentations. I'll just give some, kind of a brief introduction. And our first person will be Dianne Beal. And you got your BA in 79?
Yes.
79. And Dianne has a fascinating bio because she is a partner now. She just moved back to the States, but she was a partner in Galerie Blue Square in Paris, France. And she is a curator. She is definitely in the art field. Russian art, specifically, has been involved in so many different, exhibits. And she has, I understand, a very stimulating presentation on Russian art.
The pressure's on.
Yeah, it is, it is. And then I'll just give a couple of ideas of who else is here, and then maybe we'll start with Dianne. Next is Michael MacQueen. And boy, where do I begin? I was reading some of the things that you've written, and it took me all night to read it, but even the list of them. But your field essentially is human rights, wouldn't you say? Enforcement. Human rights enforcement. Yes, in fact, I'm not quite sure how you sleep at night, but you said that you're motivated to set things right. But he deals with things like, Yugoslavia. And other places where human rights have been violated, and has a unique, I think, perspective on how things like that do happen. I'd be very interested in what you're going to say about that. And then finally, Timothy Stubbs, and his field is banking and finance. He is with Salans in Moscow, a firm with which I'm familiar. And also, I think, as I was looking at the things that you've advised people on, things like advising the holders of LPNs issued by Finance Leasing Corporation, Russian aircraft leasing, enforcement, let's see, what else? Commercial banks, natural resources, all sorts of things. I mean, you can tell us, not only can you advise us on our personal investments, but you can also tell us where Russia is going economically.
Right and wrong.
Right and wrong. Okay, that's last, so we will be waiting with bated breath when Tim tells us what it is. But could we begin with Dianne? Dianne, tell us, I mean, I always like to start kind of with a question, but you've looked back at constructivism, Russian art, the early parts of Russian art. Is there significance for today in that?
Yes, in fact, one of the reasons I established the gallery was to show this connection between the Russian avant-garde from the early 20th century to those artists who are working today. And in 1997, I organized a big exhibition that was a traveling exhibition with the support of the University of Maryland and the World Bank in Washington to show 13 different contemporary artists at that time who had basically a direct connection to the ideas of constructivism and suprematism.
Interesting. Well, I think the idea of our panel is to kind of explain how we got where we are. How did the study of the field that you were in, basically dealing with, Soviet Union, lead to where you are today? So, Dianne, do you want to begin, and then
I'm going to actually stand up
Sure.
because I'd like to do it with the slide presentation.
Sounds good.
Let's see how this.
Okay.
Thank you.
Don't want it in your face. Oh, this. There.
Is that good?
Is that okay? Okay.
Hello, hello. So I just wanted to thank everybody again. It was so wonderful to be here with all the professors, some of the professors that I had actually back from the late 70s, and to be here with this camaraderie of people that are all engaged in this strange world. But I have to say that I have some similar background to some of the rest of us here, in that I can say that fate has played a major role in the reason that I have chosen Russian studies and stuck with that throughout my career. I think one of the things I've always said that, at least I can say that since I began practicing yoga, is that I seem to have inherited a Slavic soul. I was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and have yet to find another satisfactory explanation for the passion for all those Russian things that have filled my life. But in fact, it does go back to my education as well. One of my earliest memories is of a giant Soviet map in the 5th grade, similar to this, that was in Cyrillic. And I can just remember seeing myself actually kind of diving into the map, sitting there in the classroom. And it really did move me. But more importantly, in high school, I also had a teacher. His name was Mr. Schultz, and he taught me first a love of history, and then a passion for Russian history. He had a master's degree in Russian history, which we know at that time was very unusual. He was also the coach of the soccer team, but he passed on his knowledge of Russia and its people to me. And that's really the beginning of my career as a contemporary Russian art dealer. When I came to Ann Arbor, we were required to study this second language. I signed up for Spanish, continuing the studies that I had done in high school. But I switched to Russian my second semester, as we were talking about today. That's back in the days when we did it as freshmen, not sophomores. And I was really curious to learn more about the country and the people I had heard about. I continued to major in Russian and East European studies, profiting from the professors who were teaching political science and history, often from a Marxist perspective. Here at Michigan, I think we really relished those 60s roots of liberalism, and that was one of the things that attracted me to the school. But politically, this really rocked my world. So time and place, I think, is another factor for studying about Russia. I was born the year Khrushchev was Time magazine's Man of the Year, and came to age in the twilight of the Soviet Union. I graduated from high school 1 year after Solzhenitsyn was expelled, and my first visit to Russia as a Soviet Union as a student was back in 1979. I've been able to witness the time of glasnost and perestroika and subsequent explosion of the Russian cultural scene. So after this, we have to say, well, why contemporary Russian art? I can say that after graduating from the University of Michigan, I went to the Soviet Union, and I relished this opportunity to really interact with another society during such turbulent times. At a time when trips were organized only through Intourist, I found myself in a small group of only 6 students who had previously studied Russian. We had an unbelievable experience. That is what has kept my interest in Russia, the surprises and serendipitous experiences found by traveling and meeting with people over the last 30 years. We traveled to the Baltics, Moscow, and St. Petersburg. My first night in Moscow, I received a desperate call in Russian asking for help. Although I offered no aid, the woman continued to call and seek me out. It was my first real experience with the KGB. Fortunately, I never went to jail. Working to instill fear among the foreigners at this point was still very strong. In Leningrad, I met a Russian boyfriend, and it was there that I fell in love with the language, the people, and its culture. He took me to his dacha that I was not technically allowed to visit because it was outside the city limits. He introduced me to his mother, who adored me, and his father, a Communist Party member who wanted no contact at all. I remember eating shashlik, salted fish, ice cream, and beer, and tasting birch tree juice because there was nothing else to drink. We shared experiences with his friends in an apartment and where we discussed politics and religion. But when the subject of literature came up, Bulgakov specifically, they hushed me. All these contradictions can be summed up in this slide of a painting by Eric Bulatov. Bulatov's one of the founders of the Moscow Conceptual School. He strives to interpret Soviet power in the language of Soviet power. He used images that the population could actually understand and relate to the irony of the situation. Those of you who have traveled to Moscow, you know these are the classic words, vhod, vhoda net, that they place on all the metro doors. So it's a very ever-present symbol in your face. After graduate school, I worked for the US government writing classified reports, mostly about Soviet mountain warfare techniques in Afghanistan. So some of these things come back around to haunt us. One day I realized I couldn't go back to Russia. I did some soul searching, and I realized that it was the people and the culture that I loved. So I quit my job, and I began working full-time at an art gallery in Georgetown. My passion for the visual arts goes back even farther than my love of Russia. I always loved to draw and paint. I spent many hours in the art room in high school and can empathize with the drive to create. Most artists I know see no other path. They are driven to create. But they create, and yet to support themselves, they must sell their work. It's rare to find the artist who's able to readily translate these talents to the market. So this is one of the main reasons today that I have the incredible admiration for the artists with whom I work. This is an artist, Glukya is her nom, what do you call that, nom de pen? She's part of a group in St. Petersburg called Что делать, and they're very politically motivated in their work, but she does a lot of work with fabric and clothing. She does drawings as well. And most importantly, there have been awarded many awards, top awards, the new one now, which is called the Black Square Prize, for their short films. So it is about this time in the mid-'80s that I met Norton Dodge. Dr. Dodge, a Harvard economist who has assembled one of the largest collections of Soviet underground art, quickly became a mentor and friend. Norton was a legend among the artists. He began collecting in the 1960s and has assembled the largest collection of underground art, now over 17,000 pieces, most of which are housed at the Zimmerli Museum at Rutgers University. His collection spans the period 1956 to 1986. He basically wanted to stop at Glasnost because he felt he wanted to be pure in his collection. But I know Norton, and even today he says to me, well, Diane, you know, I really try to limit my purchases to one a week. but his wife has really tried to put the clamps on him. The cover of this 1977 publication of New Art from the Soviet Union by Norton Dodge and Allison Hilton, who's a professor at Georgetown University, was one of the only comprehensive books in English with essays about contemporary art. While working at, I'm sorry, I've just got a little mixed up here. It's a funny story how I met Dr. Dodge. One day we saw a classified advertisement in the Washington Post for Russian art. We found ourselves in a strange house in Northeast Washington with lots of art, huge sculptures made of wood and bronze. The name Norton Dodge was mentioned. I had enough knowledge at this time to pique my interest. We told the guy we were interested, but would have to get back to him. Norton was a myth and a giant at this point, but I found his number and made a call to introduce myself. I told him about the sculptures, and he told me they had been stolen after an exhibition that was held in the 1970s. He ended up having to pay a small ransom to get the works back, but our relationship began, and my career as an art dealer was born. While working at a gallery in Georgetown, the first gallery that I worked in, my husband and I began to collect works by local artists when we could find them works by Russian artists. So that's why we were looking in the classified ads to see if we could find any art. So it's thanks to Dr. Dodge's catalog that I showed you in the previous slide that we were able to identify, I think I missed a slide here. Yes, this painting by Edward Steinberg from 1967. That we found in the back of an old antique shop in Washington that was going out of business. It was Steinberg, who now lives in Paris, is one of the leading nonconformist artists recognized in international circles today. So this is a picture of the sculpture by Ernst Neizvestny, not the one that I found, but similar to the one that we found. There were some giant wood sculptures and bronzes that were quite important for Norton's collection. In 1988, the Soviet Union of Artists pronounced socialist realism as overly dogmatic. This is also the year in which Sotheby's and the USSR Ministry of Culture held the first international art auction in Soviet history. It was in Moscow, and the sale raised over 2 million British pounds. The first galleries in Moscow opened after this, and many international museum and gallery exhibitions took place in the early 90s. This is a work by Igor Kopistyansky, who was one of the artists exhibited and sold at the Sotheby's 1988 auction. They're basically kind of a famous artistic couple, almost like Rodchenko-Stepanova from the early 20th century. And they were living in Berlin at the time. But they now live, I think, New York, Paris, they're all over. They're all over. They came to visit me at the gallery in Paris one day. They walked in, and that was what was fun about the gallery there. This shocked the art world, and artists began traveling abroad. Very early on, I collected art supplies for Russian artists who had no paints or canvases and sent them back to Moscow. The lack of supplies explains in part the use of non-traditional materials in nonconformist works. In the late 80s, I worked on one of the first grassroots cultural exchanges, Washington-Moscow Art Exchange. Over 100 artists participated, and 10 Moscow artists visited Washington. This was an opportunity to work with curators from the Tretyakov Museum and many top artists, many of whom with which I still work today. In 1992, I returned to Russia with my husband, and we went to visit artist studios. We met one guy and then another. We asked, don't you have anything else? And one guy in particular, he had a whole room full of paintings just stuffed everywhere. He wasn't an artist, but he was some kind of a dealer. And finally, he looked under the bed, and he found something else. It was a painting by Vladimir Ovchinnikov, one of the widely collected artists from Leningrad at those times. And I realized what I liked about Russian art is the connection with the people. I've been dealing with the artists ever since. They are my friends, and they trust me. I am their advocate, their advisor, helping them to bring their works to the world. With that, you always have a source of product. Little by little, people heard word by word of mouth that they should call Dianne. Oddly enough, the artists helped me build the business. Throughout the 90s, I traveled to Moscow and St. Petersburg, many times visiting artist studios, collecting art, preparing exhibitions. I sold art to finance these trips and became a trusted courier for the artists and their collectors. And it was not only the openness of the artists, but also the fear and yet reverence for foreigners that gave me access. From the Soviet days, a different status was accorded to foreigners. Diplomats and journalists were the early supporters of the underground artists. They began collecting and bringing the art out of the country, showing them in the West. So when the Soviet Union no longer existed, it was the nonconformist underground artists who achieved fame and fortune. Here, Bulatov shows the setting sun as the last symbol of Soviet power. I met Bulatov in the early 90s when he first came for dinner at my home. This is a painting that is now in the collection of the Centre Pompidou in Paris. This is what I like to call the Bible. Norton's catalog for the 1995 opening of the Norton and Nancy Dodge collection of Soviet unofficial art at Rutgers. Many artists from New York, Paris, Berlin, and Moscow attended the event. And this was the first published survey of Soviet underground artists. I remember how exciting it was to see the names and photos of underground artists in a Russian publication. It was shortly after this that I opened my first gallery in Georgetown in 1994, showing artists from Moscow and St. Petersburg. In 1977, I organized the exhibition I spoke about earlier with the artists that were inspired by the Russian avant-garde. During the heyday of the art boom, a new kind of 5-year plan came about. From 2002 to 2008, prices for nonconformist art reached unprecedented highs. $20,000 to $30,000 for paintings from the 1970s by artists known only in underground circles, to $100,000 to $500,000 for artists in the West who had immigrated after Glasnost began. Today, Eric Bulatov and Ilya Kobakov regularly fetch prices between $500,000 and $1 million. At this time, the market reversed and the buyers were now in Moscow. Instead of taking work out of the Soviet Union, it was now taken back to Russian collectors from Western collections. There is already a new international market for these works, which now move across borders freely. In 2003, I moved with my family to Paris, France. This new adventure not only put me 3.5 hours from Moscow, and I could take Air France instead of Aeroflot, but it opened a whole new European collectors. I wanted to open a gallery because I realized that public knowledge about Russian art in Paris was quite limited. The historical connections between Russian and French culture were deep, but written materials translated into French were slim. I wanted to open a gallery in Paris, but with limited French language skills and no knowledge of doing business in France, the task seemed formidable. My husband suggested the only way to do it was to find a French partner. I couldn't see myself standing on the street with a sign asking for a partner, and yet he fell into my lap. And there he is. One of my French friends who works with the Ministry of Culture in Paris suggested I meet a young man who was working with her as an intern. After our second or third meeting, I said to Vincent, "If you could do anything you wanted, what would it be?" He looked at me directly and he said, "I'd like to open a contemporary art gallery." The 4 years that followed were a dream come true. We found an incredible space, a 16th century building in the Marais district, and artists in Paris and the large Russian community flocked to the gallery. This was the first exhibition we did. We actually had a young French artist as well who was a collage graffiti artist doing a performance. This was in the cave downstairs of that painting in the back. And this is the main level of the gallery. So in 2010, the year of Russia and France, we organized many exhibitions, including 2 outside shows, one with the Mairie of Paris and the other with the Louvre. This is a photo of an installation by one of the artists I work with, Igor Makarevich. That was an exhibition just organized at the end of 2010 in the basement in the medieval section of the Louvre with 13 contemporary Russian artists. It was really amazingly exciting. And this is Igor and his wife, Elena Lagana's installation. The economy was tough, and the recession also hit Europe. And so 2010 also became the year when my husband took a job with a French company that brought us back to the United States. Now free to do business again in my native country, I am preparing to open Gallery Blue Square in Georgetown. This has been a great business. It's allowed me to meet a lot of interesting people, travel, and to stay tuned to the pulse of Russia. I'm most grateful of all for a career that has allowed me to create something culturally valuable and to bring joy to people on both sides of the equation. And I have to say that I've really benefited from the interdisciplinary nature of my degree from University of Michigan, because I've been able to take all these different disciplines and put them together in the work that I do. So it's basically been a fun adventure, well suited to me, and I can stay in the business until I'm old. Thank you.
Well, Dianne, I mean, if you keep doing that, you will never get old.
I know, that's
it is. I mean, it's really, really exciting, and thank you. A wonderful presentation.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, looking forward. I live very close to Georgetown, so I'm going to get over there.
Good, yes. And I do have a website, so I have cards if anybody wants to see it.
Excellent. All right. Okay. Well, moving right along to Michael MacQueen. Michael, I'm not even quite sure where to begin with you, because you have, I mean, it's a serious field that you are in. But as you said, you're actually affecting people directly and by this. So I know you have a presentation,
Yeah.
but what motivated you? I mean, we're talking about serendipity, but was there a moment where you said, I really want to do this? Because it seems to me there would have to be a lot of dedication to being involved.
I don't know. I think it has a lot to do with the Holocaust-related work that I did for the Department of Justice, that whatever strong motivations I had to be motivated by incredible injustice have only been reified and strengthened the longer I've done this work. So,
Okay. Well, would you like to begin?
okay. Well, I had hoped to do a really organized, coherent presentation for today, and I had allotted some time Wednesday afternoon to do this when my phone rang, and I had the people who handle deportations from Texas on the line, and to let me know that a case that I had worked on a few months in the past was finally coming to fruition, that a certain gentleman was going to be put on a plane in handcuffs. And this was a case where my Center for Russian East European Studies education had come into play, not part of the main line of my efforts, but the guy was a Kosovar Albanian who, in an extremely ill-judged moment in 1999, had opened fire on a crowded bar in Pristina, killing one man and wounding 2 policemen who happened to be drinking coffee. Now, he was apprehended in the act of unsuccessfully robbing a 7-Eleven in Texas, which is how he came into our custody, we being Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and was found to have entered the U.S. illegally from Mexico without papers. And he was deported from the United States because of his manner of entry and his being caught in the act of a crime. And he submitted paperwork from a lawyer in Pristina who specializes in conducting negotiations involving the Albanian Kanun, which is the code of ethics governing the conduct of blood feuds. So the guy he killed in the bar in Pristina was the wrong guy. The son of a powerful clan whose connections extend pretty much all over Kosovo, and the word was out that either he or another male in his bloodline would pay the price for the person he had killed. So, being a REES graduate, I was able to write an advisory for the immigration court in San Antonio on the operation of the Albanian Kanun, and it was our opinion that, as unfortunate as the circumstances might have been for this gentleman, that he could not claim political asylum or humanitarian asylum on the basis of fearing the workings of the Kanun. So, anyway, my story is somewhat atypical. I came to Michigan in 1967 as an undergrad in engineering. I had no idea what the hell I wanted to do. Went to school for 1 year, dropped out, went to work as a mechanic, and it was my ambition then to be a professional racing driver. And for a number of years, I raced sports cars all over the Midwest and stuff. And there used to be this guy come in, very academic looking, beret, pipe in which he smoked Balgan Sobrania, which smelled like burning trash, and his vehicle, which was always entrusted to my care, which was a Peugeot 404. And we would talk about his car and stuff. He said, you know, you seem like a really bright guy. You know, why don't you go back to school? Of course, this was Zvi Gittleman. Anyway, so time went on. I never did become a professional racing driver. And at one point, after replacing the front subframe of a BMW, my back went out. I said, you know, this is enough of turning a wrench for a living. I think it's time I seriously investigated going back to school. And so Zvi was one of the persons when I did decide to go back to school with whom I made contact, and we never really worked together. I never did anything in the realm of political science, but he was always a monitor, kind of a semi-mentor, somebody whom I knew and with whom I could check in and whose guidance I sought. And so when I went back to school, I took an undergraduate program which was very heavy in REES courses, and I thought I was starting to see a direction in my life. And that was, I was going to be the world's biggest expert on the DDR. And that's... So you could tell I was still having some problems sorting out my priorities in terms of course, on the other hand, I would be retired by now, and I would be free to indulge my passions. But so I started developing this focus. So I did my undergraduate degree in economics, and I was going to go forward. And I did the Russian Center Masters, you know, as I continued to like refine my thinking and stuff. And that's where I fell into the clutches of Roman Sporlik. And I won't say that he, you know, somehow bit me and injected some kind of serum into me but, you know, anyway, after meeting Roman and doing some work with him, my life really changed, and I moved from socialist economic systems to ethnic nationalism, and that study is what has informed my work from that day to this. And so I went on, and I was going to do a PhD in history, and I went as far as the prelims, and went to Poland. I learned Polish, and did my dissertation research, and there was some lack of focus, and you know, I ended up writing hundreds of pages, but you know, I think it was clear that this was not going to be my path. And then in 1987, I saw an ad in the Chronicle of Higher Education. And all the credentials were lifted straight from my resume. German, Polish, preferably another East European language, and you know, study of ethno-nationalism, 20th century history of the Holocaust. And so it was that I went to work for the Office of Special Investigations in Washington, part of the Department of Justice. And there my portfolio started out being Holocaust cases involving perpetrators of the Holocaust in Poland who had illegally immigrated to the US after World War II. And then they started to give me this Lithuanian portfolio. There were some very high-profile, very heavily suspected Lithuanian perpetrators of the Holocaust in the US, but there was the problem of the Iron Curtain, and the Soviet Union would not allow access to the archival sources in Soviet Lithuania. Well, as things turned out, 1988 turned into 1989, which turned into 1990. And so one day in October 1990, I found myself on the ground in Vilnius, having taken the train from Minsk, and went to begin my task of breaking into the Lithuanian archives. And at the time, it was a period of dvoje vlasti. There was an independent Lithuanian government, and the Soviets had not yet given up. And the day I arrived in Vilnius, there was a shooting incident outside the Red Army barracks on the edge of town, and 5 people were wounded. And all night, they had these old Antonov transports flying low over the city in the murk. This is Soviet power. So, and Lithuanians, of course, had no idea who I was. And, but I did succeed in getting my feet wet as probably the first outside person to work with these sealed archives which had been under the control of the KGB for decades. And I took that initial opening, and over the next dozen years, I spent about a year and a half in Lithuania, learned Lithuanian for the job, and successfully assisted in the prosecution of more than 30 Lithuanian perpetrators of the Holocaust. And the keystone case to this was the case of Aleksandras Sulaikas, who was the head of the Lithuanian secret police in Vilnius under German occupation, who sent countless Jews to their deaths. And I kind of worked myself out of a job because I got to the point where had pretty much taken care of the case load, and everybody else in this line of, in this age cohort was kind of starting to die off. So there was a change in the law in 2004, and the one thing I learned at the Russian Center was as I had applied in the Lithuanian cases, that you have to be prepared to take on an entire new corpus of information and shed the old one. It's like, a metamorphosis. So I underwent another metamorphosis starting in 2004, and started by learning Serbo-Croatian, which I hadn't studied before, engaged a tutor in DC. I killed off about an entire forest and a half, printing out every ICTY decision up to that date, including reams and reams of witness testimony. And I set about learning everything I could about the conflict in the former Yugoslavia. And it was about this time that I started being loaned out by the Justice Department to the Immigration Service to go out. They were already rounding up a number of people, mostly Bosnian Serbs, who, having killed their neighbors and burnt their houses down, suddenly found themselves living in horribly depressed Bosnia and said, I'm a refugee, and came to the United States. And it was at working with ICE that I identified a number of things that could use improvement, and they saw something they liked in me, so they managed to work a deal where I was able to transfer from the Justice Department to the Immigration Service, which I did a few years ago. And they gave me this great autonomy to set up essentially my own program. So I am the Balkans Regional Support Team for the Immigration and Customs Enforcement's Human Rights Violators and War Crimes Unit. So our caseload is several hundred cases, almost all of them coming from the Bosnian wars. The perpetrators are Serbs, Croats, and Muslims, doing some things that I was aware that the Bosnian conflict was very complicated, but now I've had to develop expertise in odd things like the autonomous province of Western Bosnia, which was the locus of much Muslim-on-Muslim violence. Most of my caseload is Srebrenica, but I also do Croat Defense Council cases, the HVO, in various spots in Bosnia as well. And we do the cases from A to Z. We locate the people in the US, like frequently I'll show some slides in a little bit to have some of these materials. So if I'm working in an archive with some things and I find a roster, say, of Bosnian Serb police, say, whoa, it's got dates of birth and patronymics. Let me see how many of these guys are in the US. And they always find a certain percentage here. And we then locate all the evidentiary materials we can, which involves working at The Hague or with The Hague, with my colleagues at the Bosnian Prosecutor's Office in Sarajevo, colleagues in Zagreb, colleagues in Belgrade. And we then put it all together, compare what we can establish from the historical record to that which they said when they came to the US. And then we go the extra step and see what can we say about what this person actually did himself during the conflict, or herself? And can we attribute any specific criminal acts to this person? And that's at the point where we go to the enforcement phase. We determine what laws we can prosecute under, and then I put on, we call it a don't shoot me jacket. It's gotten big letters on the back, police, federal agent, and we go out and knock on the door and say, would you mind talking to us? And here's your Miranda rights, please sign this. But, there's no need to involve lawyers now. And we try and get a non-custodial statement. Most of these people, having grown up in the former Yugoslavia, knew that when the Ministry of Internal Affairs came around, you did not give them any back sass, or you would probably be peeing blood in the back of a police station for a couple of weeks. We were able to take advantage of that cultural conditioning. And they were often freely, and after having been advised, I go over it 6, 7 times, advising them of their rights. They will give a statement. And at that point, I produce a search warrant and say, well, what you told us is very interesting, but I've got a warrant from a federal magistrate here to search your property. And because I believe you're holding documents, photographs, memorabilia, and other stuff that will prove to me that that which you just told me is a lie, and it's the same lie you told to get in. And you have to understand that most of these perpetrators were proletarian origins, were peasants, that the wars in Bosnia were for them the high point of their lives, and that the memorabilia from this war is extremely important stuff for them. So photograph, me and my camis and my Kalashnikov, me and my buddies, corpse on the ground, us attending a funeral of another colleague. These are the things they save. And the other things they've done, this is particularly true of Bosnian Serbs, is they will say, well, in their immigration papers, they say, well, I left Bosnia as soon as the conflict started in the spring of 1992. And I went to Serbia, and I stayed there as a refugee, living illegally to avoid being sent back. And then they will produce these papers. See, I got married in Serbia, my kids went to school in Serbia, and the problem is these papers are all forged. And the problem for these people is often they have retained the original, actual papers because they couldn't bring themselves to throw them out. So, and just say one other thing before I go to the slideshow, that at one point I started developing a series of cases involving members of the Bosnian Serb Ministry of Internal Affairs Police, the MUP. And these guys were really the fist of Srebrenica. These are the ones who did the shooting. These are the ones who conveyed, thousands of men and boys to the execution sites, lined them up and gunned them down. And At one point, I had to be in the Serb capital, Banja Luka, another business. So before going up there, I had the name of a contact, the deputy chief of the Criminal Police Administration, Dragi Milosevic, and I love the name. It's like sweetie in Serbo-Croatian, and it's a common Montenegrin name. And I said, what the hell, let's take a chance. So we had a meeting. I had a list of these guys, their names, dates of birth, place of birth, and handed it to him. And said, Mr. Milosevic, I would greatly appreciate, I understand you've collected the personnel records of all these people here in Banja Luka. Could I have copies? And he said, you want Xerox or PDF? And so I was blown away because I thought he was going to tell me to get lost. But I'll say one thing from this experience and my continuing experiences with the Republika Srpska authorities is that they behave in a more statesmanlike manner than the Bosnian authorities do. Not for attribution, turn that camera off. And what does this tell me? It tells me that they're getting ready for independence because they want to establish a track record that shows we know how to behave like state actors do and not that dog's breakfast of a statelet, the government that you deal with in Sarajevo. So anyway, that covers the basis of that pretty much. So I have, this was done I have a lot of international connections there, and at one point I gave a training course for Croatian prosecutors on the use of documentary evidence in war crimes investigations and trials. So this is outside Vukovar in eastern Slavonia, where the terrain is still pretty heavily messed up with mines. So this is one of my law enforcement things. I cribbed together this PowerPoint in about 12 minutes, so I had to borrow from some other things, but light yellow is Republika Srpska, and the greenish color is the Federation Bosnia-Herzegovina. So about 95% of my cases come from that. And I'm doing some new cases involving the Krajina, in particular cases where thugs committed murder and robbery under the guise of ethnic cleansing. And one thing that had come to us, there's the Croatian government had filed dozens of Interpol red notices. If you see this person, you must arrest them, deliver him to us. The problem is that they could never provide proper documentation to satisfy our requirements on the underlying offense. And so what I did in my most recent trip to Croatia is I went through captured Serb records from the Krajina from the period of the Serb occupation. And some of the guys that I was investigating were so bad that they had been picked up by the Krajina Serb police. So they can't go crying, oh, this is all a provocation by the Croats, the charges are phony and trumped up just because I'm a Krajina Serb. Their own people had picked them up. Most of them ended up breaking prison during Operation Oluja in August 1995 when the Croats swept through in a blitzkrieg of 48 hours and took the Krajina back. When in Vukovar, I recommend the latte at the Cafe Bar Dixie. It's my impressionistic photograph of the iconic water tower at Vukovar, which stands right across the Sava from Serbia. So when the Serbs attacked Vukovar, the city got it from two sides. It was like the scene of the heaviest urban combat literally since Stalingrad. And when in Bratnac, that's in front of the Hotel Fontana, which was Ratko Mladic's headquarters, during his negotiation with the Dutch UNPROFOR personnel from Srebrenica, wherein he arranged for the complete handover of all control in the enclave to his own forces, like it or not. It's undergoing a remodeling at the present. That is the Kravica warehouse, where on the afternoon and evening of the 13th of July, 1995, Bosnian Serb Special Police killed more than 1,000 men and boys who had been jammed into this building opening fire with automatic weapons and tossing in grenades. There used to be tin doors on this building, which was an agricultural warehouse. Those doors had to be removed when the Serbs went in with front-end loaders to scoop up the corpses and haul them out and bury them. So that's a Muslim cemetery at the town of Vitez. I did a case a few years ago involving an HVO commander who was instrumental in the April 1993 assault on the village of Ahmici, which for every Muslim in central Bosnia, it's a date that truly lives in infamy. I have a case coming up. You'll read about it in the papers, hopefully no later than July or so, which is all I can say, that involves a low-level commander of the People's Defense of the Autonomous Region of Western Bosnia. And these guys all got their blankets at the same Agrokomerc store in Bihać. The People's Defense of Western Bosnia consisted almost entirely of former employees of the Agrokomerc industrial enterprise in northwestern Bosnia, which was a giant food processing combine whose principal director took over the entire province as a warlord in opposition to the government in Sarajevo, aligned with the Serbs, and used his corner of Bosnia mostly as this hub for immensely profitable black market operations during the conflict. This is the excavation of a mass grave at Crni Vrh. I'll be testifying in Sarajevo at the end of this month as an expert witness on how these corpses ended up in this mass grave. And that's the ethnic cleansing of Bijeljina in northeast Bosnia. Those are Archons boys. We've never found any of them in the US. The paramilitaries all stayed behind, where they formed the muscle for most of the Serbian organized crime gangs. Well, Mr. Blagojevic, you're not having a good day, are you? This is one of our subjects who we returned to Bosnia, where he was sentenced to 7 years only, disappointing, for his personal participation in the killing of captives at the Bratunats during Srebrenica. Recent arrest in Milwaukee, Bosnian Serb policeman who was part of the police force that was sent down to the little road junction of Konjević Polje, where the Serb forces intercepted the Muslim column attempting to flee from Srebrenica. It was an easy find. I was going through records at the Bosnian prosecutor's office, and if you look at the fourth line down in the Serb Cyrillic, you'll see his name, Cvijanović Mlađan, and the detachment you'll see is Od Komanda Srebrenica, with the date 13 July 1995. And even a person of my limited capacities could tell that this was an important document. Yeah. Well, how did I find him? It was easy, because under the UN police administration, the Bosnian Serbs had to cleanse their ranks of people who had been in service in certain units during Srebrenica. This is post-conflict. So they had to provide a listing to the UN of their policemen and their current whereabouts. Well, Mr. Cvijanović Mlađan, son of Rostislav, no longer on duty. Where is he? In America. Okay, that reduces the possibilities. And my technical incompetence shows up once again here, but Marko Boskic, we managed to get him 5 years in prison on visa fraud, which is an unusually high sentence for visa fraud. He's now doing 10 in Sarajevo. He was a member of the 10th Sabotage Detachment. Only 12 men killed more than 1,000 persons at the Branjevo farm killing site north of the town of Zvornik during Srebrenica. He only got 10 years for his role because he's given up 4 other members of the unit who are known to be alive and were hiding under different names, including one who was just picked up in Israel. And the fellow with his face circled in red, this is a search warrant document. It's Neđo Ikonić, and he was the commander of the so-called deserters company, young men who had deserted from Bosnian Serb service and had sought refuge in Serbia, rounded up, brought back, put in a special police unit, and served under conditions of rigorous discipline. And that's where I do most of my work when I'm in Bosnia. When I'm not out in the field interviewing witnesses, it was with my colleagues at the Bosnian War Crimes Court, either using information that they've collected, or since we have a cooperative arrangement, again, I'll be testifying there at the end of this month. So that's my presentation.
Amazing. Michael, I don't know. Michael, you have a very quiet demeanor, but it masks something unbelievable. It was chilling presentation, and I could see the gleam of happiness in your eye that you had. No, that you had gotten some of those guys. It's really, really amazing, amazing. Okay, so now we turn to our last person here. Let me see. You know, I wanted to make sure, suddenly as we were going, you do have bios a little bit, right, in your booklet there? Oh, you don't? Well then, oh, I'm sorry about that. Let me just read a little bit. And Timothy Stubbs, as we said, is a partner with Salans Moscow office, which is a law firm, right?
Yes.
But it does a lot of other things. And he's the head of the Russian banking and finance department.
That's right.
So you're concentrating on banking, corporate, and commercial law with particular emphasis on Central and Eastern Europe and the CIS.
That's right.
So very, very interested to see where you're going to take this.
Yeah, you know, it's really tough after Mike.
Yeah.
That's
Unbelievable.
really a hard act to follow. Ordinarily, when I speak in front of people, it's either my young lawyers on my team or clients, and teaching them about how to do a bankable project, how to buy or sell a company, how to build a shopping center or a hotel and finance it in Russia or elsewhere in the Soviet Union, and live. Yeah. And so instead of talking about all that probably very boring stuff, I'll try to say a little bit about myself. And so forgive me if what I have to say is maybe less spectacular than what Mike or Dianne told you about, but I learned one thing. It's always good to start with a little joke. And so I was going to start my speech with a joke today, which is, it's my joke. The definition of an honest judge. Who knows what the definition of an honest judge in Russia is? It's the guy who gives your client the money back after the other side outbid him. So, welcome to Russia. And that's a true story, actually, and it does happen. And the clients are always happy to get their money back. But I'm not really a lawyer. I must admit that I'm a pianist, a very unsuccessful and not particularly impressive pianist from a small town called Chelsea, which is about 15 miles down I-94 from here. I was raised the first 4 years of my life in North Campus when my dad was a medical student here. And then we moved out to Chelsea, and I went to state school out there. Being the son of parents who had these ideals for what they wanted their children to achieve, I was forced, like my older brother, to take piano lessons. And so the piano lessons for me were much more exciting and interesting for him, although I didn't really have much of a passion for classical music. And my interests quickly turned when I was about 11 years old to rock and roll and jazz, and that kind of fit in with living just outside of Ann Arbor, where there were a lot of interesting musical acts going on, and plus a very big peace movement. And also, I might add today, being April 2nd, it's the Hash Bash. And so it's not a mistake that I'm standing in front of you here on the day of the Hash Bash, having hitchhiked into Ann Arbor from Chelsea, skipping high school 4 years in a row to come in. So here we are. So with that in mind, kind of growing up in Chelsea with the the threat of nuclear war being pounded into our heads, and having this peace movement in Ann Arbor happening in the 1970s, and wanting very much to change the world at the time, kind of this growing idealism, combined with this growing passion for music. And you're wondering, well, what is this, this person who practices banking and finance law telling me about music for? And that was because going to Interlaken for about 5 summers in a row, and continuing to have this passion for music. When I was 16, I was chosen to join a jazz band with a group called Musical Youth International, or MYI. And MYI brought these kids together from all over Michigan on Sunday afternoons. So instead of playing baseball or football, we would schlep into Saline High School to practice on Sunday afternoons jazz, and I also had to learn very quickly to play the bass clarinet to play in the symphonic orchestra as well, which wasn't hard being a saxophonist as well. So this musical tour that we did when I was 16 in 1977, and yes, I am really 50 years old, that brought us to Leningrad and Moscow and Kiev, kind of planted a seed for me with Russia. And I saw that, you know, these people weren't so really bad or terrible after all. And even though they may have smelt a little differently than we did back then, or maybe not brushed their teeth that morning, it was still just this interaction on a personal level with these people and musicians from Russia at the time that really planted a seed and got me even thinking, you know, why is our government pointing nuclear weapons, spending billions of dollars on pointing nuclear weapons at these people, and why are they pointing weapons at us when, in fact, we're really quite nice and we have a good time together, and we had a couple nice evenings together. And so that got me thinking even more and questioning even more in the fog of my high school age brain. And so it got me interested in things, but I still wasn't quite onto the political science or the CREES program at that point in time. I was still very much being pushed. We had a mantra in my family, which is become a doctor or a lawyer. And so I didn't really want to do either, but I was very much interested at the time in music, and I had pretty good math scores on my SATs, which allowed me to get into University of Michigan. So I got into, and it's interesting to hear that Mike was an engineering student, because I was also an engineering student in undergrad, living in East Quad. And that kind of got me into thinking, and I went away for my sophomore year to Aix-en-Provence, to France. I just kind of cut loose from Ann Arbor. I guess I needed a change. And then interacting with kids at that time, that kind of even brought more questions to light. And so when I came back to Michigan in my junior year, having been an engineering student and then being away in France for a year, the first person that I went to see was J. David Singer to talk about bombs and what the hell are we doing and what's going on and how can I change the world. And he saw this young, idealistic, foggy-minded youngster, and he quite kindly entered into a series of discussions with me several days in a row during his office hours when he was available. And he said he thought I should go into political science because he thought that I had a future there, because there were things to be done, particularly in light of the Cold War and disarmament. And so that was a key first step for me into the arena of poli-sci. And when I was in France, I also had a French girlfriend who was studying Russian. And that kind of also brought to the fore that, well, gosh, instead of French, I can also study Russian. And so I started to study in the Russian language department. And at that point in time, I started to take courses in political science. And one of the big, in addition to Professor Kish and Bill Zimmerman here, and Herb Eagle and Zvi Gittelman, and Mike, who was coincidentally my a teaching assistant for Zvi Gittleman's class. It must have been all the memory loss that I had from my days on the diag that brought me to not be able to recognize him this morning. And Mike was great, by the way. Thank you very much. It was very interesting to have this continuing interest in Russia and everything, but the real epiphany came in Hal Jacobson's class about neo-functionalism and interdependence theory, and how if we buy your widgets and you buy our widgets, we will become so interdependent upon each other that we won't be able to blow each other up. So rather than fight the system from the outside, as I was on the diag with petitions against nuclear war, I should fight the system from the inside and try to change the world getting into trade. And that was what brought me to think, well, I should go into law. I wanted to, it was the combination of the family mantra around the dinner table, become a doctor or a lawyer. So I went into the joint degree program for Michigan law and REES, which allowed me to continue my studies in Russian and to continue studies about Soviet foreign policy, but also to look at the Russian legal system in the context of the American legal system. And I did a thesis, my master's thesis was on the role of the KGB as an extrajudicial organ in the Soviet judicial system. And that also kind of got me into human rights and civil rights and how can you shoot people in the head without even giving them a fair trial. While I was in REES and U of M law, I was encountering difficulties because I was finding from a job standpoint, I was ni ryba ni мясо, because the REES people would look at me and say, oh, you're the lawyer guy. You're just interested in being a lawyer. And the law firms that I was interviewing with at the time, with a passion and a desire to get into Soviet foreign trade, and this was back in 1985, they would look at me and say, you're this strange Russian guy. And so it was difficult to find a job. I also did a summer program at Leningrad State University in 1984, which was wonderful and instilled this passion for St. Petersburg, just from culturally, architecturally. And so in 1985, when I graduated from law school, I was still finishing my thesis, but it was difficult to find a job. And Professor Whitmore Gray from the law school, who was the head of the joint degree program, at least on the lawyer's side, very kindly put me in touch with a guy named Samuel Pizar. And I don't know if you guys have read of Blood and Hope, but Samuel Pizar was a concentration camp survivor who, when he left the concentration camps at the end of the war, he ended up going to get a law degree, I think, in Australia, and then he worked in the U.S. government, in the State Department for a while with the Kennedy administration, and he'd moved to Paris and started a law firm, the law offices of Samuel Pizar, and he invited me to come over to start to work for him. And so I went off, after graduating from law school, I went off to Paris thinking I would work with this guy in Soviet trade law. And the same week when I was there, I met with his former associate, Jeffrey Hertzfeld, who had left Samuel Pizar with two other associates, Carl Salans and Eliane Heilbronn, to start their own law firm, Salans, Hertzfeld, and Heilbronn. And I just coincidentally had a lunch with Jeff, and he said, listen, you really don't want to work with this guy, Pizar. He's given you this wonderful offer. And here, my dream in front of me was to work in Soviet trade with Samuel Pizar, kind of one of the founding fathers of this whole idea of coexistence and commerce and bringing our two nations together. That was it was like a pin into the balloon, and it just popped it. And so Jeff said, listen, you're not even a lawyer. How could you even think about practicing law, let alone international law, if you haven't yet had kind of the foundations? Go back to the United States and get a job in a small law firm and just learn how to practice law. It doesn't matter where it is, New York, Chicago, just go back to the United States. So I made a very difficult decision at the time, within the span of a week in Paris in that summer of 1985. And I came back to Ann Arbor, worked here for a little while, and then finished my thesis. And then got a job in Chicago for a couple of years, where I learned how to practice corporate law, and it wasn't really important whether you were buying or selling this type of company or that type of company, but learning just how to A, to serve clients, B, how to document deals, and how to take into consideration all the relevant aspects of a transaction, whether they're the tax aspects, real estate aspects, corporate aspects, the banking and finance, and just kind of learning about a lot of these things. And I was thinking, well, gosh, this is all very interesting, but I still want to get back to Russia. And so I was lucky enough to be offered a job in New York in 1988. And at the time, I don't know if anyone knows about Decree 49. Does anyone remember 1987, the Supreme Soviet adopted a decree called Постановление 49, Decree 49, which was the first decree that allowed investment joint ventures into Russia. And it was the first one since like the 1930s, because there had in fact been investment joint ventures in Russia for a brief period that a lot of people don't know about, but that existed. But it was and the decree was joint ventures between enterprises of communist country, of the communist country and non-communist countries. So it was a big deal. And that decree formed the basis for a lot of collaboration by American multinationals and other multinationals investing into Russia. So not only was it trade, buying and selling of goods, but now it became investment. And I was very eager. So for me, in 1988, New York was at least a little closer to Russia. And so I moved to New York, and I continued to learn about things which now serve me. And you guys are all academics, except Michael and Diana and Jill. They all have these interesting non-academic jobs. But standing in front of you as academics, there's a certain level of collaboration and always seeking for the truth. But in the commercial world, it's a little bit more dog-eat-dog. And particularly in the context of contentious matters, that is, any form of litigation or court. And so when I was in New York, I got my first taste of what it's like to go to court, which has actually also served me because everyone knows the phrase "Lёд тронулся," right? The ice is breaking. So I learned a little bit about how to break the ice with people in New York. And so in addition to my joke, every successful speech has a prop. And so I brought a prop today, which you probably heard the tic-tacs rattling away. When I was in New York, the head of the litigation practice was a woman named Yvonne Harmon. And I think she was the only woman in her graduating class from whatever Ivy League it was in law school. And so Yvonne, strangely enough, as a young associate, and I was, I think, a fourth-year associate at this time, she would always have about 7, and this is not an exaggeration, she would have about 7 or 8 boxes of Tic Tacs around her office. And she would constantly be chewing these things, whether it was a meeting or whatever. And so even though I was involved mostly in corporate deals at the time, because it was a New York office of a Chicago-based law firm, it was effectively a small office, and basically you had to learn to do everything. You had to be a corporate attorney, you had to be a banking and finance attorney, you also had to be able to do litigation, basically a jack of all trades, master of none. And so she had a big case, which was a shareholder derivative suit, and she asked me to take it on. It was my first trial, and I had to relearn. We had learned the rules of evidence in law school, and it was my first trial, so I actually had to spend night after night just rereading the rules of evidence and watching videos. And she brought me in. It was the day before the trial, and so I had to go in and the next morning. And she said, "Tim, when you go to court tomorrow, please take a box of Tic Tacs." And I said, what's the tic-tac thing about? She said, well, when you have to stand up and talk, your mouth gets dry. And it's really important just and it gives you something so you're not nervous. And so I said, right, and I put the tic-tacs in my breast pocket, and I didn't think more about it. The next morning when I went to court, and this is the big court, it's when you guys watch TV and you turn on the television and they show like whatever New York law TV program it is, you'll see the steps. And I was on these steps of this court. And the other side comes up, and here I am, Chelsea boy, pianist, foggy mind, a little less foggy now, but this very senior trial lawyer, who's my opponent, walks up to me, and he's obviously posing right in my face to say, yeah, and really to just kind of intimidate me, and I don't know to this day why I did it, but I looked at him, and the first thing that came out of my mouth was, would you like a tic-tac? And by him, after watching him ask with such great embarrassment whether he had bad breath, and it just kind of was lesson after lesson, learning things about how to deal with people, and about the end of the day, it's really about getting people around the table. And I try to stay away from litigation now because I really don't like it. I like to get people around the table and into win-win situations, because in my mind, whether it's a bank loan or an M&A deal, everybody's around the table. It doesn't matter whether you're a buyer or a seller or the lender or the borrower. Everyone's around the table to win. And it's not a zero-sum game. And if a commercial transaction is successful, then everybody wins. And that was something that I really learned in New York, in addition to doing documentation. My big break came when, in 1991, I was asked by a very esteemed lawyer in London, an American lawyer named Robert Starr, to come join him. So after 6 years of practicing corporate commercial law in Chicago and New York, I finally, in 1991, got my big break to go. He had asked me to come to head up his Moscow office. And so I eagerly jumped on the plane and went to London for a stint about 6 months. And then in August 1991, we saw the putsch and the whole Gorbachev and the Black Sea thing, Yeltsin on the tanks in front of the White House. And I was actually in London that summer, but came to Moscow full-time in October 1991. It was really like, if you compare it to Chicago and New York, and this was before emails and Blackberries and Skype and all that stuff, it was even more backwards practicing law in Moscow in 1991 than I could have imagined at the time, because it was really like practicing law on a camping trip. I should add at the time that I was a vegetarian. And having been, I don't know how many of you know what it was like to be a vegetarian in Moscow in 1991, and to have people look at you as if you're from another planet. And it's like, what? You don't eat meat? And how can you survive? And the stolovaya in our building, the canteen, where we would eat food, didn't have anything for vegetarians, and so it was very difficult. But I basically lived on black bread and cabbage for that first year, and vodka on the side, and then and did a lot of traveling to Kazakhstan, where we worked a lot. I was basically our Almaty office for a couple of years. And in 1993, went to St. Petersburg because we were getting, this is again another thing, you have to be responsive in practicing law. You go where the clients are telling you to go, and our firm had been working with the Gillette company, who were telling us that if we didn't open an office very soon in St. Petersburg, they would give all their legal work to Baker & McKenzie, which is one of our principal competitors. And so, so I got on a plane and went to St. Petersburg and opened our first office in the Dom Jurnalista on Nevsky Prospect, and did what people probably would think of as a very terrible things in helping McDonald's to open their first 5 restaurants in St. Petersburg, helping Neste, the Finnish gasoline company, to open their gas stations, the Royal Dutch Shell, just working with a lot of American and foreign multinationals in Russia, but all the time believing in this whole widget thing about interdependence, and I was doing the right thing. And then with Gillette, we helped them to build the factory, a very nice factory across from Pulkovo Airport, and to convince the city that they should allow Gillette to do this. And that was another thing, learning how to deal with Russian officials and not to pay bribes. And learning how to present the arguments to the officials in preparation was the key there, as I learned with the Tic Tacs, which is that you go into the mayor's office, and I worked a lot with Mikhail Manyevich, who I don't know if you guys know, but he was assassinated on Nevsky Prospect in the mid-90s, but he was the vice or the deputy mayor of Sobchak at the time. We worked very closely with him in convincing him that opening a factory for Gillette will create X hundred jobs. It will create so many more jobs because there'll be the suppliers to the factory. It will create so many tax revenues for the city, and we went through all of the numbers, and we did the presentations on the slides and that sort of thing, and in addition to that, we will be a sponsor of Zenit, the local football team. And so that's the sort of thing where you work to put a program in front of the city officials so as to keep them from reminding you about their Swiss bank accounts. And so at the time, I also got very close with the conservatory because I continued in my love for music, and worked together with the United States Consulate General to raise about $35,000 for 7 very gifted St. Petersburg children to go to Interlaken music camp for a summer. And that was really the highlight. That was a highlight. One of them stayed on at the academy, and she graduated with a full scholarship there, and she's now studying piano at Peabody Conservatory. And so it was just that ability to do something and make a personal contribution, vklad, into somebody's life. In 1999, I came back to, after the crisis. People talk about the present crisis, but I don't know if people actually remember the 1999 devalvacja crisis. But there was a real crisis, and business really dried up in 1998, and so I came back to London in 1999. And at that time, thinking, well, gosh, does it really make sense to be a Russian specialist? And why don't I do something in the region, but become more involved in an area called project finance? Project finance is actually a form of financing of a project like a dam or a power station or any type of infrastructure from the revenue stream of the assets. So instead of actually the credit rating and the whole structure of project financing is that ultimately the revenues from the asset will pay off the financing. And so that was a very interesting type of project that I'd worked on for one of our clients called the EBRD, or European Bank for Reconstruction, while I was in St. Petersburg. And that was something that interested me, and I asked my partners, because I'd become a partner at the time, I said, will you please let me go to the EBRD? And they said, what? And I said, there's this great institution called the EBRD. As you know, they're one of our key clients, and I would like to go there to work for a couple of years. And they thought I was out of my mind, but fortunately they all allowed me to go to the EBRD for a couple of years. So I took a 2-year sabbatical from Salans to go to the EBRD, where I learned about project finance and how to do these types of projects. And I also learned, most importantly, I guess you guys being academics, maybe it doesn't hit you so much, but I learned what it was like to be a client. And so I worked with about a dozen other international law firms who were serving me as the client, and I was the person, and so I learned a lot about service, but not from being the person who's serving, but from being the person who's served. And that was probably the biggest thing, the biggest lesson that I had there, was learning about service, and then coming back into Salans after that, and then starting our banking practice, and then also just trying to put into practice the lessons that I learned from EBRD. The other thing I should say about the EBRD, in addition to the institutional impact as kind of the modern day Marshall Plan, was that the EBRD has had this enormous personal impact, because it's like throwing a little pebble into a pond and then seeing the waves go out. And I see that today in looking at and listening to all of the things that everybody said about CREES. CREES has had an impact not only from an institutional standpoint and our influence on policies and at the higher levels of government, but just as on an individual level. I mean, all of you, Bill, Herb, all of the professors here, all of the work that you've done is critical for our world, not only because of the successes and achievements that you've made in your academic work, but the personal touch that you've put into every student who came here to CREES and who's gone out into the world. And Mike and Dianne and Jill would not be the people that they are and would not have the impact on the world that they do if it weren't for your contribution. So I would just like to take a second to thank you all for that. Really. And I don't know if anybody ever tells you that, but thank you very much. And all of hopefully my clients will thank you as well, the impact. But it's that individual impact, getting back to the EBRD. When I see the work that the EBRD has done, it's not only at the level of providing financing for Central and Eastern Europe, but it's at the individual level. All of the bankers that I worked with in that institution during the 2 years, not all of them, but many of them, have gone out into the world, and they're now working with Russian investment banks, Russian companies, different companies, and they've taken the lessons that they had in integrity, in doing business honestly, and how to achieve a commercial goal honestly. They've taken all that out into the world, and they're really providing the foundation for tomorrow, I think, very much in the way that we have with CREES. So building an economy and building a better world in Central and Eastern Europe. Those are just some of the things that I wanted to say. On a personal level, for me now, being the head of the department, I really don't think of myself as that as much as I would like a coach in training my young lawyers about not backdating documents, or not telling clients to pay bribes, or telling clients why corporate governance is important, why it's important to know what a fiduciary duty is and to serve the shareholder, why it's important to go out and blow the whistle when you see something's wrong, and why it's important that management and our clients, companies, act honestly, because it's not only important for their shareholders, but it's important for the world. So I'm trying to, as poorly, as bizdarna as I am, I'm trying to instill those lessons to my young lawyers. I think it was Jill mentioned the FLC case, the Finansovая leasingovая korporacja case early on. And this is just one of an example of what we're up against today. It's not a pretty picture in Russia. It's a very, I don't think that necessarily people are everyone there is a bad person, or that they're necessarily not changeable, but it's going to take a long time right now. The blur between government and business, and the lack of understanding of what a government agency should act as a regulator, as opposed to acting as a shareholder of a business, that's got to be, we've got to help them to draw the lines there. And there's a reason why it's critical for a country that someone like Mikhail Khodorkovsky should not just be put in jail or have trumped up really stupid charges brought against him a second time around, because it doesn't bring new investment and it doesn't help our children for tomorrow. And so those are things that we have to work with. In the FLC case, and you guys can Google this if you want, and I'm sure you can probably find more information on it than I can. I was working with an investment bank based in Greenwich, really a nice bunch of guys who specialize in organizing issuances of bonds, Euro bonds, for emerging markets companies. And they had come upon this state-owned company called Finansowe Leasingowe Korporacja, which is a 100% subsidiary, or at least a very highly majority subsidiary of Objedinjona Aviacyjna Korporacja, or UAC, which is the government-owned holding company for the aviation sector in Russia. They had come upon this company which engages in aircraft leasing. Usually when you buy an airplane, you don't actually buy it. You use a structure called a finance lease, which is actually, it's kind of like a mortgage, but the bank actually owns the airplane and then it leases it to a company. So this UAC, this Kremlin-owned company, had its own leasing company that was leasing out planes, and they had convinced our client to help them to organize a $150 million issuance of Eurobonds. And so our client thought, right, state-owned company, they should be really clean, right? And so they had organized this issuance, and there had been another $100 million issuance about 6 months earlier of bonds. So this company had collected from Western investors about $250 million worth of funds from these Eurobonds issuances. And they had told everyone in the prospectuses, in the investment prospectuses, that they would be using the funds to develop the Sukhoi aircraft. And our client thought, right, sounds really sexy, government-owned, they've got to be clean. And so when the Lehman Brothers September 15th hit and the financial crisis hit, all of a sudden it put this company into a glaring light as to what was actually happening. And our client, they defaulted on the first payment of interest on the bonds in December 2008. And our client then learned that the managers of the company had basically embezzled all of the funds and had gone and bought a shipyard in Germany called the Wadden Shipyards. With their own, they didn't actually buy this shipyard in Germany with FLC, but they actually formed some offshore companies, lent money under these fraudulent loans to their own offshore companies, and then went out and bought this shipyard. And so we've been trying to work carefully with the UAC management, who claim that they didn't know about it, the FLC management, who say, well, gosh, it wasn't us, we didn't know anything about it, and the Russian Ministry of the Economy, who are telling us, well, why don't you just bankrupt the company, which doesn't really make a lot of sense economically. And so we're trying to work in a system where someone's used the word kleptocracy before. We're working in a system where people just don't have an understanding of what it is to be a fiduciary, what it is to borrow money and then to have to pay it back. And just a lot of these fundamentals. And so I think it's going to be a long haul still before we see real change. There's got to, and I think we're really looking at a change in generations. It'll be a real change. I do see changes in the younger professionals that I work with, the people who work with the accounting firms, the younger people, kind of the 20s and the 30s. But in terms of a lot of the people who are in power still in Russia, I just think that there's a long way to go. And in that respect, to the extent that REES can help in terms of integrity, helping to build integrity, helping in terms of building whistleblowing programs. I look at the work that Alexei Navalny is doing, for example, on uncovering these things. to the extent that we, as a team, can work to help to build integrity and honesty in the system, I think that we would make a real change. And so, to the extent that there are opportunities for that in the curriculum and interchanges with the Russian government or Russian educational institutions, I think we could do a lot. But it's a little bit of what I wanted to say. And if anyone has any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to get a quick time check. I know we were supposed to be finished at noon. What would you suggest, Doug? I mean, do we have any time for questions or comments? Or certainly if people have to run off to something else. Oh, was it 12:30? I thought it was 12. 12:15. Oh, perfect. Okay. Well, then we do have a few minutes for questions or comments, please.
I have a question for Timothy. Have you ever figured out how you business without fake price?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, there are ways to do that. That's what we try to help our clients to do. Most of our American clients have understood that because of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, or FCPA. There's a new law that enters into effect in July, which many Americans don't know about, but it was England that adopted it. It's called the UK Bribery Act. And effectively it says that any company, doesn't matter whether you're an English company or a foreign company, any company that does business in England, whether it's by an office or whether you float shares on the London Stock Exchange, and in fact, many Russian issuers, big companies in Russia, prefer to London as a place, as an exchange for floating their shares. So any company that does business in England must abide by rules which are not only like the US FCPA, but which are actually far more stringent, and which not only outlaw governmental bribery, but also outlaw corporate bribery. That is individual bribe-taking or bribe-giving within companies, even between two private companies. So there are some steps being made there. And what we would do for joint ventures or any type of projects that required interfacing with government and governmental permissions would be, as I said, to put forth the numbers and try to appeal to people's higher selves, and also to make contributions to social, build a kindergarten or build a with McDonald's restaurants, it was, we're going to build a nice big playground next door, and that was actually at a time when there were no playgrounds, no children's playgrounds in St. Petersburg. But there are ways that you can work with government to do the right thing in a way which benefits the community, and we're not just investing money on a purely commercial basis, but which does ultimately get the job done without paying money into an individual's bank account. It could be, donating, 24 new computers to the Department of X, where the money goes into, the system, the state budget, as opposed to an individual bribe. But those are the types of things that we do.
Anybody else?
I have a question for Dianne Beal. Some of the Russian traditional art I'm familiar with, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the European markets in particular were full of forgeries. I'm thinking of icons and other things that were thought to be, stolen directly from a monastery. And with the underground art, that means by definition that the provenance is difficult to track in some cases. How do you govern the authenticity of the art with which you deal?
Yes, actually, I was thinking about some of the comments that Timothy made in this regard, and that it's kind of part of, I would say, a little bit of a Russian tradition to take some liberties with signatures, changing dates. And we see this very much with the early avant-garde works. There was a flood of work that came out that was forged. There's some very good forgeries that it's difficult for people to make a difference. But it actually has crept all the way up to nonconformist art as well. Fortunately, some of the artists, most of the artists are still living today. Oscar Rabin, for example, in Paris, his work is forged a lot, and I know his work very well, so people write to me, they ask me, is this real? Sometimes I tell them right away, no, this looks terrible, or yes, maybe, and then I send it off to Oscar, and he's still around to authenticate it. But it is a major problem, I think, in a lot of things related to Russia. Not as bad as the Chinese, I think.
Yes, please.
Thank you. I have a question for Michael. Considering the intersection between academia and the kind of work that you do, you're right down there on the ground, creating the opportunities to bring people to justice. Are either governmental or international organizations or universities, as far as you know, tracking the impact of this burgeoning prosecution of human rights violations, the impact on people who might be tempted to engage in those human rights violations? Has the last decade and a half in that respect had any deterrent effect that we can detect?
In a word, no. International prosecutions seem to have minimal deterrent effect, unfortunately, because I think the power of the ideologies is so strong that it overcomes any scruples. And that the people who are directly engaged in a given struggle, often these aspirant, power groups, as they're called, operate, in complete and total disregard of international standards. The other side of that coin is, you can call me a pessimist, but one of the main reasons behind creating international courts, such as the ICTY for the former Yugoslavia and stuff, was to make a contribution to reconciliation. And unfortunately, from my close observance on the ground and following the press and some of the NGO reporting that is my standard daily information diet, I see us making virtually zero progress in terms of reconciliation. So it shows, when people ask me, something, give me the situation in Bosnia in a nutshell. I say, well, there's only two things that are in excess supply in former Yugoslavia, and that's bad feelings and leftover munitions. So it's not a very cheerful worldview, but it is what it is. So hope that answered the question.
Yes,
just a quick follow-up. Do you think that performance of these acts essentially transforms these people in a way that is sort of irremediable? That once you've been involved in this kind of killing, it changes you forever, and of course a lot of people have been involved to a greater or lesser extent. And that's what makes reconciliation so difficult, is that?
I would say that there is like a collective post-traumatic stress disorder that operates. When you look at Bosnian society today, the most powerful social groups are veterans groups, invalid groups, things of that nature, who are staking their claim particularly on the state budget. And this is true both in the Federation and in the Republika Srpska. But on a micro scale, I do see this quite frequently, like the initial confrontation with somebody. I've dealt with a lot of guys whose eyes focus in two different directions at the same time. These acts left a mark, and I think without a proper account, what they're going through now is, from a historical perspective, very close to what Yugoslavia went through after World War II, where they obliterated the history of Chetnik and Ustasha crimes and, operated under a phony rubric of brotherhood and unity. And now there's, kind of a glossing of the history, a selectivity in prosecution in many cases, a social turnoff to the process of justice that's occasioned by the horrible social conditions on the ground with 40% plus unemployment. So, they don't have the opportunity to be able to participate in any kind of a social process of justice because, the immediacy of the struggle for existence trumps all other considerations. So.
Let's see one more.
Yes, I was more interested in what Timothy Stubbs had to say, especially his concluding remarks. Even in our country, as you know, in the last few years, it's always, don't do what I do what I say. And this is in the corporate world, all sorts of ways. And there's a matter of situational ethics that he's talking about and raising a new Russian generation in how to do these things, even though some of the things we don't throw our people in prison. There are no American Khodorkovskys. But there are various gray zones. And I think what you're doing on the ground with entrepreneurial types, new entrepreneurial types, is very important for the future of Russian democracy and, for that matter, the future of whatever Russian capitalism arises. I think it's very important to keep that in mind. So much of this is situational ethics, and this is a very difficult area for us. What you tolerate and what you say you shouldn't tolerate, very difficult area. And I think when you deal with these young would-be Russian entrepreneurs, you're doing them and the world a great service.
I wanted to thank our panel very much. I mean, personally for me, it was extremely interesting to see how in all of these different areas you've made enormous contributions, I mean, in a very deep sense, and all because of what you learned here at the University of Michigan. So it's testimony, even if there was serendipity involved, that people went deeply into their fields because of what they learned here and made these contributions. So thank you very much.